coronavirus claims a life outside China, while inside, hundreds of Canadians await rescue.
And more than 40 new confirmed cases were reported from the virus-hit cruise ship docked in the Japanese port of Yokohama.
Toll from the new coronavirus has jumped in Italy overnight.
In France, the culture minister has become the first member of the government and the fifth lawmaker to be infected with the novel virus.
Trump declaring a national emergency just a little while ago.
WHO has been assessing this outbreak around the clock. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
So we're not going to talk just about the impact of coronavirus. We're going to talk about how it's affecting various aspects of health policy. Today, in our very first podcast, though, we're going to have a look at how different countries are approaching the coronavirus pandemic, how we think these policies will evolve, and what public reaction has been. And I'm joined by some colleagues from around the world for our first podcast. First of all, Ajoy Bose is in Delhi. Ajoy Bose is in Delhi, a long-time foreign correspondent, best-selling author, and an expert on the Beatles. But I think it's more your public health background that we're interested in, Ajoy, today. Sharon Kamtai she's joining us from Nairobi today. Sharon, a former TV journalist, now working in health communications. So Sharon, I think you've had your first case in Kenya of COVID-19, right?
Yes, just yesterday, the first case was confirmed by the government, the Ministry of Health yesterday.
We'll get that perspective as well. Thank you. And then from the country that's probably appears worst affected, at least at the moment, it may just be the country that's reacted fastest. Corrado Tomasini joins us from his flat in Milan.
I'm chained at home and I am talking to you. Very happy to be here with you from the hotspot of coronavirus now. So it's a very unreal situation now.
And then we have James Snodgrass, who's just down the road from me in Wales, in the country with the fewest restrictions at the moment, where we have a particularly cheery attitude to the pandemic of if we ignore it, it'll probably all be okay. Or am I? Yes.
I think, Mark, you're paraphrasing a little bit much. I mean, we've got an interesting situation in the UK where actually public opinion is running ahead of government directives, but we'll come on to that later.
And then Denise Gray-Felder is joining us from the United States. So Denise is struggling with the least developed telecoms infrastructure of anybody on the call. And her video comes and goes, right, Denise?
And the least developed public policy, too.
I don't know. I think that's a close contest between the UK and the US. Also, a regular fixture on these podcasts is going to be Kieran Watts, who's here in Wales as well. And Kieran is going to report to us on what media and social media are doing. So Kieran, let's start with you, if we may, and let's have a quick media update. I know we have a few graphs to show. Start off, if you would, with a few media highlights.
Well, between January the 1st and January the 20th, when the pandemic was in its initial stages, the media reporting wasn't at the scale it is now. Come January the 16th, cases started to emerge outside of mainland China, and the media coverage increased sharply, jumping by January the 23rd to 50,000 worldwide on a daily basis, with the death tolls beginning to increase by January the 26th. Media coverage actually did decline because of the lockdown in China. When the world did still consider this an issue that was confined to China, it dropped to 30,000 for a few days. But actually, when cases began to increase in South Korea and Italy after February the 20th, there was a massive spike in the media cases, with 262,000 reports daily being reported by February the 28th. And then what we had, the biggest rise, understandably, was when the World Health Organization declared a pandemic. This resulted in 673,000 news reports daily. As a result of that, and media outreach has actually now peaked at over 1.5 trillion because of the sheer volume of news reports on the coronavirus by major news outlets. And what this amounts to is a complete saturation of the media with news pertaining to this pandemic.
All right, so Kieran, week by week, we'll come back to you and we'll get to sort of dive a bit deeper on some of those topics, but thank you for that. What I'd like to do first is look at how different countries have been approaching this pandemic. And maybe we should start at the two extremes. So if it's okay, I'm going to start with Corrado and then come to Denise, and James, you can chip in as well. Corrado, Italy has acted really extraordinarily decisively to try and slow down, I guess, the spread of COVID-19 and to try to limit the impact. Tell us a bit about what the government's doing and what your perception is of how that's being, of how that's likely to evolve.
Yeah, I think you are right, and the government has been very, very active. And compared to Italian standards of government, this is something very valuable. But probably, I believe it moved too late because the lessons from China were already there some weeks before it started moving. Since it started moving, with the red zoning activity, will have its effects. But I think that the best thing would have been to shut down all the country right from the beginning, because we already knew how the things was going to work out. And the other thing that the government could have done more effectively was to build up the capacity of hospitals.
But Corrado, your hospital capacity, your ICU capacity, is I think about 4 times ours and about 4 times the Americans. So I think, well, if a country with 4 times the ICU capacity that we have is struggling like this, what will happen to us?
It's a struggle that if you see the death tolls now that we are having in Italy, it's a very, very difficult situation. And now the divide is between the people that stay at home and that are lucky, like me. We are complaining about nothing, but people that are working in hospitals.
So Denise, let's go from that extreme, the extreme of having closed down the country, or as I'm sure you know. Let's move from that to the United States. I think you knew it, but how does it sound hearing Corrado describe Italy versus what's happening in the US?
Well, it's sort of bittersweet, Mark. Thank you. But our policy is actually getting a little bit better. Our practices are getting a little bit better in the past couple of days, thanks to, many of us know Tony Fauci at the National Institutes of Health, who really has become the savior of our country in this regard, because he's been able to finally move our president to take some action. The hospital situation will always be problematic in this country, because any good hospital in this country on any given day usually has about 90% capacity.
I think, Denise, that you just quickly, you used to be head of communications for a major hospital system, right? For a university hospital system.
Yes.
You said that the US is a bit like the UK, that we have very little spare capacity, and a bit like Portugal and Spain indeed, very little spare capacity in the healthcare system to cope with surges like this. What do you imagine is going through the minds of people running healthcare systems?
All the major academic medical centers have, and that's probably, maybe 30 or 40 or so in the country, they all have rooms set aside for crisis, for, epidemic rooms, and those rooms are typically not used unless they just really have a major accident. But there's no way near the numbers of rooms that you would need if suddenly even in a single city. So I would imagine that they're looking at their how they can set up temporary facilities in tents or in other buildings. They're looking at partnerships with other hospital chains that are near them. One thing that we do well in this country, in the private sector, is come together and collaborate with each other when crises hit. So imagine there's a lot of planning going on right now, but everybody's keeping their fingers crossed, hoping that this won't happen.
Thanks, Denise. Right. I think we should look at the other country, which is following pretty much the American policy, which is the UK. So, James, in Britain, we've taken this view that it's wrong to impose restrictions now, that the government's point of view is that if we impose restrictions now, they'll be less effective when they're really needed. Yeah. But some sign today that the government is being forced by public opinion to move faster than it wanted to.
I mean, I have to say, the government's position has been backed up by many, senior epidemiologists working in the UK as well, which is that we want to actually try and get the virus out into healthy members of the community, over the next few months. So we really want to try and get, say, 60% of the population exposed to coronavirus over the next few months. This is because their view is that coronavirus is going to be a seasonal virus. Transmission will decline over the summer months, and then it'll come roaring back in the winter. If you do a big lockdown now, there's only a certain period of time people are going to be prepared to accept to have a total lockdown like they have in Italy. So the UK government policy is to apply restrictions very slowly and gradually as the pandemic builds, and then as it heads towards its peak, then put a lockdown in place during the peak period. We're gambling that we can actually, people after exposure will have immunity or some level of immunity, so that if they get re-exposed, their symptoms will either be non-existent or very minor. Whether this is the case, we cannot be sure at the moment.
Sharon, Nairobi, you said your first case yesterday. So in many ways, Kenya at the earlier stages of this epidemic. What approach is the government of Kenya taking at the minute? And to what extent is there a feeling that this may be under diagnosis?
So far, the government has banned all public gatherings, rallies, inter-school competitions, but on the other hand, they seem quite confident. Of course, the public is not confident at all, to be honest, and we are just waiting to see. So it's just a matter of we wait and see, but at least most citizens are taking the necessary measures needed. The only thing that we've noticed actually is that there's been a lot of panic buying, a lot of misinformation on social media. So it's something that the government is really monitoring closely, especially the misinformation on social media, because it's causing a lot of panic.
I want to move on to Ajoy. And Ajoy, in India, you've taken a bit of both, right? There is now almost a total lockdown on immigration into or not immigration, on people coming into the country, as I understand it. But the level of domestic restrictions is not that high. Is that right?
I think India has done quite well so far. There's been less than 100 cases, only 2 deaths, 4,000 people on watch as potential sort of cases. And I think it's been very lucky that the first cases were discovered in Kerala. And Kerala has got a very good healthcare system, probably the best in India. I think huge amount of restrictions are now in place. But there is a big question about testing, whether there is enough testing really to sort of corroborate the low figures so far. There are more and more testing sites being opened up. The Indian Army has got involved. So they are helping the civil administration. And I think there is also a South Asian response because Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, actually spoke to his mortal enemy, Imran Khan, the Pakistan Prime Minister, to start South Asian regional conference on video, amongst all the leaders of the region to see whether they can unitedly fight this virus.
Bringing people together at least in South Asia.
And I think that is quite, because they were talking about a war till very recently, but somehow this virus is changing, all that. And it's very interesting that Imran Khan immediately responded, fine, we'll have this, video conference.
Which is a lesson we could learn in Europe, because we seem to be going the other way. Sharon, I wanted to ask you about this heat issue. Does Kenya feel, Kenya's not among the hottest countries in Africa, of course, but does Kenya feel that being on the equator may offer some protection, or is that a false comfort, do experts think?
Yes, it is something that most people have mentioned. People feel like probably we do have some hidden cases and we do not know about it. So that is why the government is also urging people to learn how to do self-tests.
And how are they doing self-tests? I don't think anybody else has self-tests.
Apparently, the government wants to hire several people to do door-to-door awareness to teach people how to do self-tests.
Thanks, Sharon. Corrado, I wanted to quickly come back to you, and this has been such a fascinating discussion. We're running longer than I thought we would, and I don't want to test our viewers' patience too far. But I did want to come back to you and talk about where you see this evolving. So if I understood you correctly, Corrado, you were saying that you thought that many Italians thought the peak of this would come in the next couple of weeks. Is that right?
Well, I think so. I believe so, that the peak will be in 10 days, because you must think that up to last weekend, in all southern Italy and central Italy and Rome, people were still going around and having parties and doing everything.
What about that issue that James has talked about? I mean, the British, certainly the Americans, in the context of their presidential election, which I'll ask Denise about in a second, are very worried there might be the second wave.
I think everybody hopes for a vaccine or anything that could prevent, and they are very, very positive about the new antiviral drugs and the new drugs that has been tested and that seems to have good results for people that are in severe conditions.
James, in the UK, how much do you get the sense that people understand what a bold or risky policy the UK government is following?
Well, I mean, it's clear that there has been, a lot of criticism of the proposed policy, but it is, as I say, interesting that, the UK, because it has a very centralized health system, is actually quite well admired for its level of pandemic preparedness. The criticism tends to come from professors of infectious disease, say, rather than from professors of epidemiology. The question about whether the coronavirus does not stimulate a sufficient immune response is one which will hopefully become clear in the next few weeks.
Because we have these anecdotes from China, don't we, about people who appear to have cleared the virus and then test positive again. So,
yes,
but it is anecdotal.
In part, that is because we do not have a proper antibody test as yet.
So, Joy, I know that in India there's been a hope expressed by many politicians that the summer is going to definitively finish off the coronavirus epidemic, because there is a belief, although scientists I think have been challenging it, that it can't survive in temperatures above 26 C.
I think people are very, very fearful of the next few weeks, because we shall know the next few weeks whether it is only coming from abroad or whether it's, it is already spread in between, So I think India is not out of the woods yet, certainly.
I would like just to make a general comment, and I think that from a public policy, the fact that every country is going its own way is not the best thing to fight a virus. I mean, we should have a defined strategy, each and one for every country. And, it will end up in having one country following the other, and probably the virus will keep on living in the best way and keep on returning. So it will be a hell of a nightmare if it goes like that.
I agree with you, Corrado. That's a really good point.
It's a crucial point, isn't it? And I think it's a really interesting one you make, Corrado, that the WHO has been relatively powerless to get the world to follow a coordinated action. Thank you all for today. Been absolutely fascinating. We will come back with a second podcast next week, tele podcast next week, and we'll have a slightly different panel. But we'll ask all of you to come back and revisit this, if we may, in 3 or 4 weeks' time, and see where things have progressed to and how our forecasts have stood up. So thanks very much indeed to all of our guests today, to Ajoy Bose in New Delhi, to Sharon Kantai in Nairobi, to Corrado Tomasini in Milan, to Denise Greyfelder in New Jersey, and to James Snowgrass, me, and Kieran Watts here in Wales. Thanks again.